spheres, and it's worth pausing for a moment here, we encounter what, in its very essence, is nothing but a reflection, but not just any reflection. It's the one that establishes itself in the duplicity of the sign that governs it. Now, within the scope of this reflection, the one that Villanueva has brought into play, whose relevance is, as we might say, evident at the heart of the so-called Spanish scientific revolution, a perspective opens up that touches, in a radical way, the real. Indeed, his discovery is nothing other than having stumbled upon that nail of which, in this case, we can say it's just the tip of what concerns us here. If we have called it, and not by chance, the inverse possibility of the impossible specularity of the real, is precisely because it's about, and this is crucial, what's at stake in the very structure of the topos, in the very arrangement of the topological fields where the surface of reflection becomes problematic. We are not, let it be understood, dealing with a mere optical projection. We are facing a dialectic, in the strictest sense of the term, of the symbolic inscription of the reflection. Villanueva shows us that, in the economy of the mirror, and it's no accident that we speak of economy here, there lies the possibility, or rather the tension between the possibility and its own denial of an artificial symbolization that in its very movement slips away, evades, becomes elusive. It is here where the subject, if we can still call it that, gets trapped, caught between theoretical specularity and the impossibility of its closure.
Since the 17th century, numerous scientists and optical researchers had shown a growing interest in the effects produced by mirrors. While the phenomena of reflection were already well understood and formed a fundamental part of optical studies at the time, a select group of scholars ventured into more advanced hypotheses, ones that were difficult to verify with the instruments available in their era. Within this context, the figure of Gaspar de Villanueva stands out. Born in what is now Malaga, he was a learned scholar whose work, published posthumously in 1687, presented a series of unconventional theories on the properties of mirrors and their potential influence on human perception of reality. In his treatise, The Transport of Reflective Spheres, Villanueva meticulously laid out various principles of optics and the nature of light, exploring how mirrors, under certain specific conditions, could alter the way objects appeared to the observer. Most of his text focused on the phenomena of reflection and refraction, analyzing how different materials and polished surfaces shaped the images they reflected. However, in the final section of his work, he introduced a concept that, by the scientific standards of his time, was particularly enigmatic and nearly impossible to verify empirically. Villanueva proposed that human sensory experience was limited to a finite set of stimuli from the physical environment, but that beyond these boundaries, there might exist an enveloping plane, a dimension beyond direct perception. According to his hypothesis, certain entities could manifest within this plane, and under specific circumstances, become partially visible through the reflective effects of certain mirrors. While he provided no conclusive evidence to support this claim, he argued that the composition of certain types of glass and the particular incidence of light upon them could create the right conditions for such apparitions to be fleetingly detected by the human eye. Villanueva's theory was not well received in the scientific circles of his time, partly due to the lack of replicable experiments to substantiate it. Nevertheless, his writings stand as more than just an obscure curiosity. They are a testament to the speculative thinking that characterized the scientific revolution. For this reason, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who formulated his theory of the real, not only based on the scientific advancements of his own era, but also drawing from knowledge of earlier centuries, referenced Gaspar de Villanueva's treatise. Although Jacques Lacan did not live to witness the vast advancements and practical applications that emerged from his theory, his ability to anticipate highly complex concepts remains a subject of analysis. After his passing, several of his relatives and disciples continued to develop his ideas, adapting them to new currents of thought. Lacan's intellectual legacy extended beyond the realm of social sciences and psychoanalysis, reaching into fields as diverse as mathematics and the deeper foundations of the natural sciences. In this context, The interest that certain American researchers showed in Lacan's work in the early 21st century becomes particularly relevant. By the year 2003, some of these scholars had already established close ties with high-level government agencies, including the Pentagon, with the aim of assessing the applicability of certain Lacanian notions, particularly those drawn from and refined upon the conjectures of Gaspar de Villanueva. To bring the Renaissance scientists' theories into tangible form, an interdisciplinary team worked intensively between 2004 and 2008 on the design and fabrication of mirrors and spheres, whose composition and structure aligned with the characteristics described in 17th century texts. These early attempts were not limited to traditional optics. They also incorporated conceptual refinements derived from Jacques Lacan's later interpretations, as well as the theoretical geometric implications explored by the group of mathematicians who had studied the real during his seminars. The early phases of the project faced significant challenges. Initial experiments confirmed what had only been theorized until then: the immense complexity of generating a specular vision of the artificial symbolization of the real and the dimensions of jouissance. It was not until the year 2007 that Dr. Jean-Baptiste Leroux, a specialist in non-Euclidean phenomena from the University of Paris, proposed a reformulation of the problem. After a detailed analysis of Villanueva's writings, as well as corrections to Lacan's own interpretations, Leroux concluded that the structure conceived by the Renaissance scientist could not be replicated within the confines of a conventional laboratory. The key was not in fabricating a small-scale mirror with special optical properties, but in creating a large reflective surface capable of interacting with light and the conditions described in Villanueva's texts. With this new perspective, the research team relocated to the town of Ojo Amarillo in the state of New Mexico, where they began constructing an underground facility in a virtually uninhabited area. Over the course of nearly 8 months, several structures were erected to support, above ground, a large-scale specular apparatus. Due to the relatively recent nature of the case, leaked photographs of the construction only reveal the early building stages. However, the images obtained from the projection of what came to be known as Villanueva's Great Mirror remain, to this day, a subject of debate due to their unusual nature. Today, remnants of the operation carried out in 2008 can still be seen on maps, where the excavation sites have been replaced by vast water reservoirs. The area now also serves as the location of one of the campuses of New Mexico State University.
Jacques-Alain Miller, the intellectual heir of the renowned psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, was not merely the one to carry on his work from the 1990s onward. As Lacan's son-in-law, Miller enjoyed a number of privileges when it came to accessing the most closely guarded material of the famed psychoanalyst. Through the Staffarella Foundation, Miller took it upon himself to keep both the manuscripts and recordings of Lacan's lectures, delivered from the 1950s to the 1980s, under strict lock and key. In fact, the famous seminars, 27 volumes of which remain incomplete, are part of a collection that many psychoanalysts worldwide have called into question. These critics accuse the edited volumes of censoring much of Lacan's teachings, while also distorting, with Miller's express authorization and interpretation, several ideas that remain hotly debated to this day. The concept of the real has been particularly problematic even in 2024, since there is a mysterious break in Lacan's work that occurred in 1975. That year, almost all of the still unreleased versions of the seminars were withdrawn for a personalized edition, overseen by Miller. Only a handful of people worldwide have gained access to the original material, which, although censored, offers a closer understanding of the French analyst's ideas. Alfredo Edelstein, an Argentine intellectual, has publicly expressed his opposition to Miller's monopolization of Lacan's teachings across various South American and European media outlets. Moreover, he has accused Miller of malpractice regarding his involvement in certain experiments conducted in collaboration with the American Psychoanalytic Association. Many of these experiments, carried out in the utmost secrecy, have violated numerous international agreements, human rights treaties, and ethical commitments of the scientific community. Roberto Rodriguez Stoltenberg, an Argentine psychoanalyst and member of the school renewed by the Real Freudian Cause, affiliated with Favaloro University, emerges as a key figure in this matter. In one of his books published in 2009, Rodriguez Stoltenberg dedicated a chapter to the first known ethical complaint against Miller. This text, digitized and available in several Argentine university repositories, addresses the broader ethical issues surrounding the practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis, particularly those related to the treatment of the concept of the real, a notion that extends beyond the classical philosophical obscurantism stemming from some of Heidegger's ideas that Lacan explored. Rodriguez Stoltenberg openly admits his involvement in 1997 in one of the few experiments with predominantly favorable results regarding the transductive machines of the real. The author reveals that between 1992 and 1998, he actively worked alongside Jacques-Alain Miller and the American Psychoanalytic Association at their facilities in the state of Maine. Although the project was not initially considered secret, after the results emerged, efforts were made to keep it outside the scope of traditional psychoanalytic institutions. It is worth noting that, unlike other disciplines and fields such as psychology, psychiatry, neurology, or mental health in general, Millerian psychoanalysis has sought to go beyond the standard concepts of science. These results have shown that, from the perspective of the real, many events that might even be considered supernatural or paranormal coexist within the reality of each of us. Certainly, my involvement in Professor Miller's experimental trials has compromised my standing in the psychoanalytic field. It is no surprise to me that, in recent years, invitations to various symposia in Argentina have diminished, especially considering that the Lacanian Orientation School and the Stafferla Group have gained such influence among prestigious universities. Buenos Aires, once the epicenter of orthodox psychoanalysis, has, let's put it this way, been gradually succumbing to Miller's revolution in the study of the real. This shift, moreover, has been making an increasingly troubling impact on clinical practice. However, I cannot distance myself from the responsibility tied to this reality. I participated in some of Professor Miller's most bizarre experiments, and it is my duty, 12 years later, to allow the community to fully understand what anyone could call grave ethical violations, not only in science, but against humanity itself. By 1997, I had been working for 5 years with Jacques-Alain Miller's American team in Penobscot County, Maine. Although he did not visit us as often as we might have wished, we had the opportunity to present our findings on the real in about 7 or 8 instances. It was during that year that Professor Miller directed what I would consider the only project with overwhelmingly fruitful results. It was October, and early in the month, we were assigned to the custody, surveillance, and physical examination of 3 inmates from Allenwood Penitentiary at the institute where we worked. These 3 men, all in their 30s and of similar build, had been sentenced to life imprisonment for homicide. Their selection did not seem coincidental, as all 3 were of similar height, Irish descent, and had witnessed certain effects of the real 6 years earlier. The first thing that struck me, to say the least, as both curious and troubling, was that the 3 men had absolutely no idea why they had been relocated. In conversations with them, they told me that the Institute's agents had invited them to undergo a physical examination for academic research purposes. While that was technically true, they were entirely unaware that the real reason for their presence at the facility had much darker undertones. The first major test took place on October 10th. Jacques-Alain Miller was present and highly involved at every observation and testing point. The conference room on the second basement level had been completely outfitted with the equipment Professor Miller had brought from New York. I can't fail to mention that Alexander Simard also accompanied him, one of the most prominent figures in the research of the real in America. I would go as far as to say that if it weren't for the fact that Professor Miller is the sole legal owner of Jacques Lacan's original writings, Alexander Simard would have taken over this investigation years ago. The conference room was unrecognizable. Every single seat had been removed, and even the stage platforms, along with the rest of the room's foundations, had been stripped away. At the center stood a structure about 4 meters tall, completely covered in metallic plates. In the heart of this monumental device was a semi-translucent hatch, through which the opposite side of the room could be clearly seen. Surrounding it, a series of cabins filled with electrical panels had been installed, tightly sealed. They had gone to great lengths to create hermetically controlled environments, isolating each one from the others, and most importantly, from the central structure. We, the members of the Institute, were truly astonished. In all the years we had worked there, we had never encountered an intervention of this scale. Professor Miller and his team tasked us with examining the 3 prisoners, but they didn't even bother to send us a note explaining what kind of tests these subjects would undergo. And don't even mention the overhaul of the conference room. My colleagues and I had lengthy discussions about the situation, even considering the possibility of submitting a formal letter of protest to the Institute's leadership. However, there was one particular incident, perhaps even symbolic, that quietly made us abandon any thought of resistance. When Alexander Simard first entered the meeting room, where we were set to discuss matters with Miller and the rest of his team, he was accompanied by 3 Pentagon agents. The facility and the entire county have been properly secured by agents and a heavily armed military contingent. The perimeter of the building has been cordoned off, and the access routes in and out have been placed under federal control. Those were the first words Alexander Simard spoke, even before introducing himself. Jacques Miller was involved in matters that seriously threatened the security of the United States, and against that, we had no choice but to follow orders. In the early hours of the morning, when we were summoned to the conference hall, we were instructed to change into specific attire. Everyone inside had to wear a white lab coat over a special yellow radiation suit. Our eyes were to be shielded by dark goggles, and we had to wear shoes with thick, insulated rubber soles. However, the 3 prisoners were required to enter in their regular uniforms, thin shirts and pants, and standard-issue sneakers. Unlike us, who had to be heavily protected inside the hermetically sealed capsules, they were directly exposed to the monumental device that stood in the middle of the hall. Our team's task appeared relatively simple: constant monitoring of vital signs and a written report of everything that transpired once the test was ordered to begin. Both Miller and Simard were in a cabin facing the large structure. With them, a team of engineers was adjusting the control panel, which I assumed operated the main structure. I say assumed because neither before nor after the experiment were we given any explanation of what had actually occurred. Once everything was ready, Miller spoke in somewhat broken English, surprising for a man of such international acclaim. He ordered the 3 prisoners, who didn't seem either surprised or frightened, to line up in a column. After hearing the siren through the speakers, they were to cross the translucent portal of the enormous structure one at a time, without rushing, and most importantly, in complete silence. Miller and Simard watched every move the prisoners made with extreme caution, while ensuring their vital signs remained within expected parameters. When the first man had to cross the portal, nothing seemed to happen. The man didn't appear affected by anything. When asked to share his sensations, he simply said that it felt a bit warmer on the other side, but nothing else was different. The second man's turn came a few minutes later. Everything proceeded just as it had with the first, except for one detail. The second prisoner reported feeling pain in his arm, like a burning sensation. However, after a few seconds, he recovered. What happened with the third prisoner was frankly horrifying to witness. The man crossed with as much confidence as the other 2, but something went wrong when he passed through that thin, subtle layer forming the portal. The third man became trapped by a force that held him right in the middle of the structure. He began to scream, complaining of intense pressure in his abdomen that soon turned into excruciating burning. "It's tearing my insides apart," were his last words before we all watched in terror as that invisible force began to tear his tissues apart. His torso's skin wrinkled as quickly as it stretched until it ruptured. In a matter of seconds, his muscles and all of his organic material were laid bare. His spine was exposed until all that remained was a reddish gelatinous mass spread across the semi-transparent layer of the portal. Professor Miller's team reacted as if they had anticipated such an event, while we stood there, witnesses to a ghastly scene. Through the speakers, Dr. Simard's voice was heard asking the other two prisoners what they had seen. Both responded that nothing had happened yet. They still saw the third man standing on the other side of the portal. When Miller heard that response, he said to himself with a tone of satisfaction, "They're not coming back." We understood the meaning of that phrase about 15 minutes later, when Simard's team began dismantling the control panels. The experiment was over for them. Monitoring their vital signs was no longer necessary. For the French psychoanalyst, they were likely already dead, trapped in a dimension where material existence no longer held any meaning. I later learned, and this was the reason for my resignation from their team, that the two prisoners had managed to cross the fabric of the real. This meant that their conscious and unconscious apparatus had been severed. Although they saw themselves in the conference room awaiting further orders, the reality was diametrically different. Their level of consciousness was temporarily halted to such an extent that, lacking the experience of jouissance, they would live that moment in an indeterminate time frame, possibly approaching infinity. The physical body no longer mattered. In simple terms, their minds were left in an ethereal state, detached from their physical faculties. That horror would keep those men trapped in a parallel version of the world forever. It was never entirely clear if that state could be reversed, but it was likely a fate beyond the control of the research teams. Even the accident involving the third prisoner lacked a convincing explanation, aside from the probable intolerance to the artificial effects of the real created by the machine. But one thing was certain: in 1997, they had managed to control, for the first time in history, a dimension of the real.
The series The Real, a concept drawn from the most unsettling depths of Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory, caused a great stir by addressing the well-known case of the mannequin. This figure, discovered in Canada in 1988, marked a turning point by tangibly illustrating how the phenomenon of the real manifests in our everyday lives. Its discovery not only broadened the horizons of medical, social, and natural sciences in general, but also intensified concerns about the fragile line that separates symbolic reality from that which resists symbolization. Within this context, Professor Takeshi Yamamoto emerges as a pivotal figure in the expansion and reinterpretation of Lacanian ideas. After hosting Jacques Lacan during his historic visit to Japan in 1971, Yamamoto embarked on a series of studies that even surprised the French psychoanalyst himself. Lacan, accustomed to a limited reception of his theory in France, and to a lesser extent in the United States, was intrigued to discover that his ideas had been translated into Japanese and enthusiastically embraced by the leading schools of psychology and philosophy in Japan. This interest was neither casual nor circumstantial. During one of their conversations, Yamamoto offered a perspective that deeply resonated with Lacan. The theory of the real was intrinsically connected to fundamental elements of Japanese culture. According to Yamamoto, phenomena that had traditionally been interpreted through folkloric narratives or superstitions, such as paranormal apparitions, legends of demons, and their supernatural powers, could be re-examined through the lens of the real. The resistance of these phenomena to being subsumed into language, along with their unsettling and disruptive nature, seemed to Yamamoto a confirmation of the universality of Lacanian theory and its ability to transcend cultural boundaries. The significance of Lacan's visit to Japan grew over time. It not only marked a milestone in academic dialogue between East and West, but also paved the way for theoretical developments that predated the case of the Canadian mannequin. In fact, a decade before this phenomenon shocked the international community, researchers at the University of Tokyo had already encountered a similar figure. This precedent not only foreshadowed the impact of the Canadian case, but also reinforced the notion that the real is not confined to any single cultural or geographic context. Rather, it represents a constant that universally permeates human experience. In 1980, Professor Yamamoto led an ambitious experiment at the University of Tokyo, aimed at exploring the boundaries of the real and the possibility of manipulating its effects to symbolize them in some way. Convinced that certain environments could be designed to intensify or isolate the manifestations of this phenomenon, Yamamoto assembled an interdisciplinary team of physicists and engineers to construct a space that would defy traditional laws of perception and reality. The first phase of the project involved the development of a synthetic material, a groundbreaking substance that mimicked plastic but possessed properties unlike any known compound. This material, created from a combination of experimental polymers and rare elements, had the ability to alter the physical and gravitational characteristics of the space it enveloped. The substance was used to completely seal an underground cavity specifically designed to serve as a plane where the rules of conventional reality were pushed into the background. Initial reports revealed that within the chamber, time appeared to flow irregularly. Mechanical clocks slowed down, while digital ones advanced erratically, creating a profound sense of temporal disconnection between the interior and the outside world. The experiment, however, was not without its incidents. During an early testing phase, one of the technicians, tasked with handling and applying the insulating material to the walls of the chamber, made a critical error in manipulating the substance. While attempting to adjust a section of the coating, his right arm was exposed to an unexpected reaction from the material. What followed was described as a horrifying event. The technician's limb began to distort, as though being pulled toward a vanishing point in reality itself. Despite immediate efforts to assist him, the damage was irreversible. The technician was left with severe deformities, particularly in his limbs, along with multiple injuries across his body. His muscles and bones appeared to have been reconfigured into a strange, unrecognizable pattern, defying traditional anatomical structures. The accident had a profound impact on the team. While some researchers abandoned the project, unable to cope with the implications of what had occurred, others, including Yamamoto, saw it as confirmation that they were indeed working at the threshold of the real. As the professor himself stated, "We have crossed the border of the symbol and are touching that which resists being named." This space is both a discovery and a danger, but it will be of immense value in understanding and finally closing all the gaps left unexplained by science. Despite growing fears, the experiments continued under strict safety measures. The isolated chamber, which the team began referring to as the Room of New Time, became the setting for a series of tests exploring the interconnection between the symbolic and real planes in Lacanian theory. The Maine test yielded its first significant results after nearly 15 failed attempts, during which researchers encountered phenomena ranging from minor anomalies to episodes of spatial distortion that forced the experiment to halt multiple times. However, on the 16th attempt, something occurred that exceeded all expectations. A female figure, resembling a mannequin, materialized against one of the narrow walls of the Room of New Time. Her appearance was sudden, as if she had always been there, but only now became visible. The entity made no sound, displayed no signs of breathing or evident movement, yet her presence elicited a deeply unsettling feeling of being watched. Astonished and cautious, the researchers attempted verbal communication, but quickly realized the figure was incapable of responding. However, when they monitored the computers connected to the Room of New Time, they discovered that the entity was transmitting signals to the electronic systems. At first, these signals seemed random, but they soon began to form a structured, comprehensible language. To their amazement, what appeared on the screens was a dialogue that seemed to originate from a conscious source. Yet the entity's responses were cryptic and lacked the natural logic characteristic of human communication. From this interaction, only a reconstruction based on the original transcription exists, its contents kept under strict confidentiality by the University of Tokyo. Below is an excerpt of the most significant fragments of the dialogue.
When I decided to study psychoanalysis more deeply after completing my psychology degree at university, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Many still hold on to the image of Freud, often distorted by those who made little effort to read him, let alone study him thoroughly. Yet, psychoanalysis is much more than psychosexual theories. Dozens of authors have emerged since the 1930s, some adhering strictly to Freudian psychoanalysis, others openly challenging the master. And this latter approach became the logic of analysis itself. Freud turned into a historical figure, an author of his time, impossible to align with the modern era. While his discoveries and academic contributions were revolutionary for a field of medicine that had yet to consider the subjective experience of life, the limitations of his time kept him from addressing other matters. That's where Jacques Lacan, a French analyst, came in. Despite his own reluctance, Lacan delivered a series of seminars in the 1950s that, through his boundless genius, pushed psychoanalysis to unimaginable frontiers. The French author brought about a complete reorganization of Freud's foundation, breaking away from old frameworks, and discovering in the founder's writings the seed of a much more complex knowledge. The mind, the psyche, even what some might call the human soul, could no longer be defined by physical and concrete models. It was now time for a topological, mathematical, and abstract explanation. Although Jacques-Alain Miller, Lacan's successor, has faced much criticism, it's undeniable that thanks to his continuation of Lacan's work, which was left unfinished in the 1980s after his death, phenomena that had remained shrouded in darkness for science have finally been explained. And thanks to the psychoanalysts who followed this path of investigation into what is known as the real, I was granted more than just a privileged insight into something that caught me completely by surprise. After my divorce 4 years earlier, I must admit I wasn't really ready for a new relationship. At 42, the weight of age had me focused on other matters. Luciano, my only son, had moved to Brazil to study foreign languages, and I was on the verge of earning my doctorate in psychoanalysis. It was during a symposium led by Professor Diana Rabinovich at the Faculty of Psychology at the University of Buenos Aires that I met Victoria. Since we were both in the same field, it was easy to strike up an initial conversation, one of those that seem rather superficial at first. She was 3 years older than me and had been widowed 10 years before. After a few dates, we made our relationship official, and thus began one of the most peculiar episodes in my psychoanalytic research. After a few months, we visited her mother's house in the Palermo neighborhood. Her mother, elderly and under the care of a nurse, also lived with Victoria's older sister, who'd been bedridden for life after an accident in her teenage years. When they told me the story of the accident, I was so stunned that my mind went blank. But a few days later, while talking with Victoria, I shared my wild idea that her older sister might have been affected by the real. Although we were both trained in psychoanalysis, Victoria had specialized in child and adolescent therapy, so her academic focus was much closer to Kleinian theories and the work of François Dolto. For that reason, she wasn't familiar with the research Jacques-Alain Miller had been conducting on Jacques Lacan's more obscure concept. To provide some context, it's necessary to recount the accident involving Victoria's sister. Valentina, at the age of 15, was on vacation in the Uruguayan city of Punta del Este. There, she was the sole survivor of a horrific fire in which all of her friends and schoolmates, who were with her on a summer school trip, perished. The trauma was overwhelming, and what initially seemed to be minor injuries from the flames eventually destroyed Valentina's life. She had been rushed to the hospital for a burn on her arm. At first, the doctors assured her she would fully recover in a few months, although she would be left with a permanent scar. However, as the weeks went by and months passed, Valentina began to lose sensation in her arm. The wound from the fire spread to her shoulder, and soon her entire right arm became completely paralyzed. Her arm became as rigid as stone. The muscles stiffened in such an abnormal way that no doctor was able to correctly diagnose her condition. After 2 years, the poor girl, still haunted by the psychological aftermath of the catastrophe, began to experience troubling psychotic episodes. She claimed to see worms crawling up her arm each night, laying eggs in tiny holes. The nights became a living hell for her. The worst came a few months later when, convinced that these worms would eventually emerge from somewhere in her body, she grabbed a knife and gouged out her own eyes, believing they had turned into worm eggs. After this incident, Valentina never spoke again. Her right arm, year after year, began to lose its normal skin color, turning a grayish hue. By the time she turned 26, her entire arm had taken on a metallic appearance, including the visible bone and muscle structures. Despite numerous suggestions for amputation, she adamantly refused, terrified by the thought that the infection would spread to other parts of her body. After the self-inflicted attack on her eyes, Valentina communicated only through a small notebook, and even then, with great difficulty. Most of her entries were filled with what psychiatrists dismissed as nonsense. Throughout her adulthood, she remained under her mother's care, confined to a dark, poorly ventilated room for nearly the entire year. When I saw her a second time, I vividly recalled some chapters from Jacques-Alain Miller's writings, and above all, the lesser-known research of Laurent Panchou. Valentina lay bedridden, carefully attended to with all the necessary precautions given her condition. Her eye sockets had dried out in an unnatural way, almost as if they were two large holes lined with brittle cardboard. Her right arm, or what remained of it, had transformed into a metallic mass that bore little resemblance to a human limb. Her lips had cracked to the point where they were indistinguishable from her wrinkled skin. Her hair was reduced to mere tufts of whitish strands, and the rest of her body clearly showed signs of malnutrition. When I discussed this with the nurse, she told me that, despite Valentina's deteriorated health, she was somehow stable. Her body, strangely enough, had an almost superhuman ability to process nutrients and all kinds of food. Even though she was fed large amounts of calories through a tube, she seemed to continuously lose fat and muscle. The nurse also explained that her sole task was to monitor Valentina's health, feed her, and bathe her. In all her experience, even in nursing homes, she had never seen anything like this. When I shared this theory with Victoria, she reacted with some unease. She couldn't understand how Lacanian psychoanalysis could extend to cases like her sister's. However, it became much clearer once we revisited what Valentina had written years ago in her attempts to communicate. For years, Valentina had been describing an aberrant world in which she claimed to be trapped. Despite her writing containing serious grammatical errors, it was still easily understandable. She spoke of being in a place very similar to reality, but everything around her was covered in a reddish, gelatinous mass, and she could no longer recognize faces. Humans had become something like charred statues, emitting incomprehensible noises. As strange as this was, what I learned next left me speechless. Victoria revealed that, although her mother had always been fully aware of the accident, she never saw her daughter in the grotesque state we could now observe. In fact, up until a few years ago, she had normal conversations with Valentina, and this couldn't be explained by dementia or any similar condition. Her mother simply couldn't see her daughter in her true physical state. With a much clearer understanding of the case, I decided to present it, along with some colleagues, to the School of Lacanian Orientation, which was led by those close to Jacques-Alain Miller. After that day, I awaited a response, but all I received was a note in which Lacan's heir promised his forthcoming support for the case. To this day, I've heard nothing more on the matter. However, some friends of mine who live in France have mentioned that this man recently presented a case in Marseille that is suspiciously similar to Victoria's. Perhaps he is not to be trusted.